So, good morning. Dr. Leiter became ill and couldn't attend the meeting today, so what he did was he emailed me his presentation, and I have not touched it. I'm just going to present his work to you, and that's Dr. Leiter in the bottom right-hand corner. So the talk that Dr. Leiter was asked to present was from the Hering-Breuer Reflex to NAVA. And basically, the reason he was asked to speak first was to set the stage and just to give you a little bit of an overview about the control of breathing, the ventilator, and the patient. So I think here what he was trying to show is that you have a patient and you have a ventilator, and that during mechanical ventilation, the ventilator affects the patient, and the patient in turn responds to the ventilator. When the patient reacts badly to the ventilator, he bucks the ventilator. And I actually had to look up that word because I wasn't quite sure. But it means to resist stubbornly. So he's trying to say that the patient fights the ventilator. And when that happens, what we often do is we take the patient out of the equation using anesthetics and narcotics, which he said is an oddity of modern mechanical ventilation. The one person most deeply involved is never asked what he or she wants. Under what he calls normal circumstances, and I think he meant like in a non-ventilated healthy person, reflex mechanisms provide feedback so that the patient is always informed about the chemical and the mechanical milieu in which ventilation is occurring, and now it's the patient who is the respiratory controller. There are respiratory motor commands coming from the patient and sensory reflex mechanisms continuously feeding back to that patient. So you have a loop now. And that feedback is the key concept. The Hering-Breuer reflex is the first description in biology of negative feedback. The translated title of the paper, which was published in German, is actually Self-Steering of Respiration Through the Nervous vagus nerve. The self-steering that concerns us derives from the observation that preventing an inflation at end expiratory lung volume will increase the duration of the subsequent inspiration, and it will also increase the amplitude of respiratory muscle activity. So that's when you do an occlusion at end expiratory lung volume. The self-steering is lost when the vagus is cut. That's the evidence that it's vagally mediated. As stretch receptor information derived from increasing lung volume during each breath arrives in the central nervous system, it tends to turn off inspiration and reduce muscle activity. So what happens is the stretch receptors in the smooth muscle of the larger airways, as the lung is stretched, they fire more feedback to the respiratory centers and terminate inspiration. We used complicated bioengineering methods, pseudo-random loading with imperceptible PAV and system identification to show that the Hering-Breuer reflex reduced the duration of inspiratory time by 0.04 seconds on average in normal awake subjects. And when I say we used, he meant he used. So in the long run, it's a long run but a short slide. So to conclude, he says, in healthy, awake adults, the timing aspects are actually quite tiny. It's not so for the intra-breath inhibition of respiratory muscle activity. So we have our old figure, which is our loop that says the patient is in respiratory control. A more important effect, especially when using NAVA and considering the old loop we described, is that you have respiratory motor commands coming from the patient. And now what we've done is we've incorporated a ventilator into this loop that is actually controlled by the patient, but also is able to receive sensory reflex mechanisms. This is a slide taken from Lucas Brander's paper, and I'm not going to go through the details. I'm sure you'll see it throughout the meeting, but basically it's a slide describing how the patient responds to increasing levels of assist during NAVA. And as the amplification of the diaphragm activity increases tidal volume, the increasing volume feedback inhibits the diaphragm activity. And the changes in the relationship between tidal volume and the diaphragm EMG reflect the activity of the Hering-Breuer reflex. and the NAVA level changes the relationship between EMG and volume-dependent feedback. And I actually sent Dr. Leiter an email because this to me sounded very confusing. I didn't understand it. And he said, if anybody asks you, just tell them it's very circular. That's all I'm supposed to answer. There's a lot more going on than just volume-related feedback. For example, everyone likes a certain flow pattern. He gave a reference for that. And everyone likes a uniquely different flow pattern. And there's a reference for that as well. Chest wall, proprioceptors, and muscle spindles also provide feedback that modulates respiratory activity. The blood gases, which are all that physicians usually focus on, also provide feedback control of respiratory motor output. The state of the patient modifies the intensity or the strength of these reflex mechanisms. And I think we often forget that, is that, yes, we know all about these great reflexes, but it's actually, they're modified by the state of the patient. This rich mix of sensory information that controls ventilation is often missing in mechanically ventilated patients. But, and again, here he puts a figure describing a closed loop between the brain and the feedback systems. And now in the upper right, is there a pointer? It says NAVA, which is NAVA. It says physician-controlled, now interposed as a multiplication factor in this reflex loop. Now the reflex mechanisms are intact, excuse me, and the patient and the physician have a role in deciding what the patient wants and receives. All of the reflex mechanisms controlling breathing evolved to simultaneously optimize blood gases and make breathing mechanically efficient and well integrated with the other activities of the patient. This multivariate optimization is lost when the patient is sedated and the physician uses blood gas values only or primarily to control ventilation. NAVA and proportional assist ventilation, which is another mode of assist giving proportional assist, they both restore the opportunity for the patient to participate in the decisions about the flow pattern, tidal volume, respiratory timing, regularity of breathing, and subjects hate monotonous regular breathing, blood gases, and so on, while still allowing the physician to intervene. The challenge is to use and interpret the information contained within the diaphragm activity effectively. And that's it.